Hello and welcome to Classic Book Reviews with David. In this video I'll be discussing The Tractate Middoth by M.R. James. Now it's one of my favourite M.R. James stories and that's why I'm reviewing it. I thought for a long time that I was probably the only person who particularly liked this story. That is until a few years ago when it was adapted for television. So it was good to know that other people liked it as well as me, or as much as I did. The story opens with an elderly man called Mr. Eldred visiting a library and requesting a book. And a person who works at the library, and Mr. Garrett, goes to get the book, but returns empty-handed. And he explains that when he went to get the book, there was a man there in the library with his back to Mr. Garrett, and the man was holding on to the book, so he couldn't get it for Mr. Eldred. Mr. Eldred leaves and returns the next day and once more requests the book, so Mr. Garrett goes off to get it. Mr. Eldred waits and waits, and he walks round and gets a bit, he gets a bit fed up of waiting, and after about 20 minutes he inquires, what's going on. So another member of staff investigates, and it transpires that Mr. Garrett has collapsed and has been taken home. What caused this collapse? Well, we find on a little later in the story, and I'm going to read a quote from the book as to what Mr. Garrett saw, and this is what he said. Now, the person he'd seen the day before he thought might be a clergyman, and when he semi-recovered from his collapse, this is what he says. And there was my parson again, back to me, looking at the books on the shelf I wanted. His hat was on the table, and he had a bald head. I waited a second or two, looking at him rather particularly. I tell you, he had a very nasty bald head. It looked to me dry, and it looked dusty, and the streaks of hair across it were much less like hair than cobwebs. Well, I made a bit of a noise on purpose, coughed and moved my feet. He turned round and let me see his face, which I hadn't seen before. I tell you again, I'm not mistaken, though for one reason or another I didn't take in the lower part of his face. I did see the upper part, and it was perfectly dry, and the eyes were very deep sunk, and over them, from the eyebrows to the cheekbone, there were cobwebs, thick. Now that closed me up, as they say, and I can't tell you anything more. So yes, that's what caused his collapse. He saw this creepy-looking figure. So it suggested to Mr. Garrett that he goes away to the coast and has a bit of a break for a week or so, and that's what he does. And on the train, he meets a Mrs. Simpson who's there with her daughter. And it transpires that this Mrs. Simpson is actually cousin to Mr. Eldred. And it also transpires that these cousins, Mrs. Simpson and Mr. Eldred, had an uncle called Dr. Rant. This doctor was very wealthy. He had an estate with a large house, large grounds, and lots of money. And he was an unpleasant person, and Mrs. Simpson had looked after him in his last days. And just before he died, Dr. Rant had said that he'd left everything to Mr. Eldred. But there was a will somewhere in one of his books, and that will left everything to Mrs. Simpson. Unfortunately for Mrs. Simpson, she's never found this will. She's not sure it still exists or where it is. But Mr. Garrett knows, or thinks he knows, where this will might be. It might just explain why Mr. Eldred is looking for this book and wants this particular book. So it becomes a race. Mr. Eldred wants this book, The Tractate Middoth, and so does Mr. Garrett on behalf of Mrs. Simpson and her daughter. I won't give any more away at this point, but it's quite different in some ways to the normal M.R. James stories, which normally involve someone, usually an academic, being pursued by something malevolent. In this case, it's good people against a bad person, and it's a race against time and each other. Who will win? Will it be a dark ending, an unhappy ending? Will it be a happy ending? Which would be very unusual for M.R. James, and I won't give that away, although I'm tempted to. I really like this book. It's got the usual M.R. James things of something malevolent, sort of vivid descriptions, the usual academic type, and that's Mr. Garrett, and the like, and fans of M.I. James stories who haven't read this will like this story as well. But it is also slightly different in that there's a more human element. I know it's an odd thing to say, but it's got women in, which is fairly unusual. Usually it's male dominated. Okay, these ladies don't play a particularly big part, but it is a little bit refreshing to have women in the story. I really enjoyed the story, and that's why I'm reviewing it. I don't think it's quite as good as Casting the Runes or A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which I've also reviewed for YouTube. And I'd probably give it 4.5 stars out of 5. But because I don't really give half stars, I will give it 5 stars. There we go. And that's it. If you want to read the story, I'll put some links below to where you can buy the book. And you can always follow on Twitter, on Facebook, and you can always subscribe if you want to. And that's it.